My name's David Hallauer with the Meadowlark Extension District. Unfortunately, on this topic, got to talk to some of you this summer, so hopefully this will be a little bit more positive conversation. In the back there, Ross Mosteller, our District Livestock and Natural Resources Agent. We're going to tag team on this deal today some, and I think he's got a lot of really good information. I think one of the things that there's a few things we want to come out of this day. Obviously, we want it to be informative. We do want it to be informal. We want to get your questions answered. I wish I could tell you that we had all the answers, but we don't. We're still kind of in a learning curve as well. But I also think that one of the things that as we've gone through this the last 2 days that I think is really good is, we're going to wrap up this morning as Ross is talking about some stuff, maybe of some alternatives as well. And so, we've been in some of these systems for some time, especially on the brome grass side. And if you start to look at maybe what this has been in the past, brome grass has been the thing that in all these years has been the predominant species of feeding on, other than some cover crops, of course. And so from that standpoint, we're going to offer some alternatives to you as well that maybe you want to consider. So again, we want it to be informal. We'll do our best to answer your questions. We don't have any printouts for this particular part of the meeting, but we are planning to send out the slide set and stuff when we're done. So there are a couple of note cards on your table. On one of the cards, what we would like you to do is just put your name and some contact information. One, just a kind of a record of being at the meeting. And then two, if you are interested, we would like you to write at the bottom of that thing that I'd like to, just write newsletter at the bottom. And then we'll get back with you later and find out which newsletters that you maybe want to receive. And if you don't, that's fine. We'd still like to have a record of you being here. The second thing is there's another note card on your table. If you could take that note card, just sometime as we're talking this morning, and just write before, and then write on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being, I didn't know anything when I walked in the room, to 5 being, I got a pretty good idea, I think what's going on. We're going to do a before and an after rating so we can kind of see whether we're hitting on what we need to here. So we'd appreciate that. And again, want to get you the information that we have, so we're going to hopefully leave plenty of time for questions as we get done. And we're going to have pizza at noon, so you're all welcome to stay for that and stick around and have some more conversation as well. So this is just a little history. I'm not going to belabor this. I only throw this up here for two reasons. One, this isn't new. If 2025 was the first year you happened to see it, then that's great. There's been some years where, as you talk to other agents, as I talk to other agents across the state, 2021 in East Central Kansas was horrible. I complained a lot in 2021 about the pressure, but it wasn't near what it was in East Central Kansas. And so when they were talking about stand losses, I was a little bit, that's not that. I'm really not too concerned about that. But they didn't have a ton of pressure in 2021. They had some, or 2025, they had some, but nothing like what we had. And so this is a pest that I think is probably around on a fairly frequent basis, just at varying levels. And we've just unfortunately got in about these last 3 cycles, quite frankly, have had some pressure to the point that it's of concern. It's not a new phenomena. Places in the South maybe are dealing with this thing 3 generations a year. Talked to our area extension agronomist last week. She said she had spoke to some people at some meetings in the Southeast, and this is year-round stuff for them. These pests migrate for us in from the South, but down there they don't ever go away. And so they're feeding on fescue and causing them lots of problems down there as well. It's a worldwide problem as well. Our entomologist this summer told me that he got called about consulting on some grasslands. It was either in South America or Africa. Migratory animals, nothing to eat because fall armyworms are taking out their grass stands. So it is a problem. We've gotten to the point where numbers are fairly consistent every year. And so the question becomes is how are we going to continue to deal with this? So I put this slide up in 21, and then I've gone through and kind of marked out some stuff that has changed a little bit in my thinking over time. I still think that our recommendations are sound, but based upon what we know a little bit more about our stands and a little more about this pest, I've added a few comments here. And the first one up there is, I really don't believe that they overwinter in Kansas, but boy, it sure feels like it. I wouldn't say that if we had a pretty mild winter that they might not stick around. We just don't tend to get that very often, They're not going to survive much below freezing, and so when we get those freezing temperatures, they kind of go away. But on yesterday, there was one in a moth trap at Grantville. Maybe it was left over from before the frost. I don't know, but I was down there last week and there was 10 of them in there. So they're sticking around a little bit. Are they doing any damage at this point? No. They're headed back south. They're just passing through, but they are here later, I think, than what we originally thought that they would be. You know, as we first started talking about this pest 10, 15 years ago, unfortunately, my response was typically, we're going to probably have a generation and we're going to go all shucks and then we're going to have the grass recover and then we're going to be fine. That's not maybe my thinking anymore. You know, I think we're seeing multiple generations of these things. I know we're seeing multiple generations of them. I took out the deal about timing of arrival can be different from year to year. I do think that we're going to tend to get these. We can just about bank on them in July at some point. So we need to start scouting in July and be taking a look at them. I took out May in that fifth line there. We may see them. We're likely to see them every year. I think they're just something that we're going to get to deal with. Will we see them at the numbers that we had this year? I hope not, but I think that's what we're going to deal with. You guys know how they operate. You know what the sizes are that we deal with. We still know that our insecticides work when those insects are small better than they do when they're large. And we know that they are going to eat the vast majority of what they are going to consume out there in the last 3 to 4 to 5 days of their life. And there's a lot of variability that comes with products and timing and all those sorts of things that we're going to talk about. But we just know that by the time we get out there and we see damage, that we are kind of we're hurting at that point. And to a point sometimes that we can't do a very good job of recovering. Again, multiple infestations are possible. And then I put this treatment triggers down here, and I'll really go to this slide to talk about that a little bit. You know, these are the treatment triggers that we have kind of had, you know, in the back of our mind for years. And I'm not going to tell you that these still aren't good. I'm not going to tell you that if you go out there and you say, I really like some rule of thumb that these are not good, because they are. I will tell you that the University of Missouri would suggest that maybe it's 3 to 4 instead of 4 to 5. So kind of keep that in mind. I think when we have stands that are under duress, late harvest, stands that, you know, maybe have been hit previously, that number changes, okay? So it's a good starting guideline, but I do think it is one of those numbers that you keep in mind and say, you know, when we talk about these things, we talk about, well, there's a science to it, and there is, but there's also I just have this really bad feeling that this is not going to go well if I let it get any further. And so kind of keep that in mind as well. I will say this as well, as much as they can overnight eat an alfalfa stand, I have been maybe you guys would tell me differently, but I have been very happy with the way that our alfalfa stands have responded. You know, in many cases, some of them have been completely mowed off, and they've come back very, very well. Now, weather has a lot to do with that. Unfortunately, in our brome grass stands, that has not been quite the case. We struggle to stay ahead of them because they start out and all they're doing is this little window painting. And so it's really difficult to see that. We don't see the forage loss. You know, again, by the time they get to be an inch long or so, they're eating a lot more forage and we can see it. But by then, we're kind of behind the curve. And so we've really got to start thinking about a scouting standpoint earlier in July, and doing so by looking for those window painting. You know, I'm all about getting down on the ground and digging through the foliage and trying to find them down in the debris. But this window painting is really probably as good of a first look as anything. And so kind of keep that in mind. I think that is an important facet of this thing because these things are going to, you know, get down in the debris, especially as we go into the heat of the day. They're going to burrow down under that stuff, and sometimes it's not pleasant to be out there anyway looking for them, but they're going to get down in debris and they're going to be very hard to find. I would also say that when they first hatch, those very first instars as they come out, you know, they're less than the width of your pinky in length, okay? They're very, very small. They're very hard to see even on the leaves. In fact, I've even gone to, you know, in addition to the window painting, as a first kind of look, if you've got a sweep net, take that out there and go through that forage. If you've got a bucket, just take that bucket and drag it along the surface of that forage just like that. Drag it down as close to the ground as you can, but that will, in many cases, be your ability to get a first look at, are they out here or are they not? Okay? So that's a good way to scout, but they're hard to get ahead of because they start and we just don't see them until it's too late. There's lots of factors that also go into the damage that they're going to cause. I'm really more and more convinced that we've probably seen this pest more frequently than what we catch them. You know, if you look at the last 25 years that I've been looking at them, 20 years or so, there's probably years we didn't even see them. So I think they're out there, but sometimes when we get delayed harvest, sometimes when we get really droughty weather post-harvest, sometimes if we have stands that are struggling a little bit because of fertility, or we've harvested, you know, pretty short, or any of those things can cause problems. We probably have them out there some years and everything is going through and that plant is cruising along and we don't even see them. But when any of these things come into play, all of a sudden we run into some problems. I threw this map up here. This is from our mesonet station at Corning. You know, and you look too at sometimes what we get for some of those early year type of temperatures. You know, sometimes we've got a grass plant that is maybe growing. You know, we're getting up to 50, 60, 65 degrees. Maybe that grass plant starts to think, man, it's time to get rolling. And then we get a freeze injury or something like that maybe sets that plant back a little bit. And also the insect, it likes a certain temperature range as well. You know, so 70s and 80s predominantly for them. You know, it likes some level of moisture out there. They're generally coming in with storm systems in some cases. And so when we start to get to this point of summer and maybe we have days where it's fairly cool, we get a little moisture, all of a sudden we've got an attractive environment. Now I will say that this year I really thought that even our hay harvested in early to mid-July, I thought that it had nice recovery. We had moisture. In many cases, some of those stands came back fairly well. But when you turn dry after that and you get warm into late July and the early part of August, that plant doesn't recover nearly as well and all of a sudden you have problems. I will also say that in a lot of cases, we are looking at spots or we're reporting on spots maybe that have had a first injury, or we're starting to see damage, and we kind of sound the alarm at that point. Weather from north to south, east to west might be different enough moisture-wise, temperature-wise, that in many cases I would say that from what my observation this summer was, I was finding things 2 weeks earlier in the southeast part of our district than I was up here. So when we start to sound those alarms, you know, that is probably going to be good for you guys, because I'm looking for clear to the south to find where those numbers are starting to come up. So there's going to be differences based upon weather, moisture, temperature, all those sorts of things. And again, the stress of that on that plant is going to be different based upon all those things as well. One of those was the moisture that we lost after harvest this year. You all know what it was like in your particular farms. You know, some places had good moisture after harvest, some places didn't. Kind of depended on when your harvest was. But as a general rule, we lost soil moisture later in the summer. We had surface moisture in some cases, but we lost subsoil moisture. And at that point, those plants struggled a little bit to kind of persist and stay out there. Keep in mind as well that brome likes temperatures in the 70s and lower 80s. And when you have temperatures in the 90s day after day after day, that plant sort of just stops. The armyworm does not stop. It prefers those lower temperatures, but it doesn't stop feeding. It is going to finish its life cycle. In fact, it's going to speed up its life cycle in many cases. We do have a pheromone trapping network. I don't know if any of you follow along. I've tried to put this a little bit in whether newsletters or radio programs, blog posts, but you can see, I think, on here that we had a couple of distinct little flushes when those numbers started to come in. You know, here in the early part of August, and then again in the early part of September, kind of just right on schedule. So what this pheromone trapping network is basically we've got this funnel out there. It's got a pheromone in it that attracts the males. The males come in, they're attracted to that pheromone, they go down in this bucket, there's a kill strip in there, the moth dies in there. It doesn't mean anything about what feeding pressure is. It doesn't mean that your farm might have 100 moths and my farm might have 1,000 moths. All it is presence or absence. At least right now, we are not able to correlate those numbers very well. But it does show us, it's kind of our first warning system of, hey, we've got moths in the area. It's really time for us to start scouting at that point. And then again, you can see too, they're on about a 30-day cycle. Life cycle of that thing's going to be about 30 days from start to start, 30 to 40 days, give or take a little bit. And about half of that, about 2 weeks of that, is going to be active feeding, okay? The other problem that we have with this, though, that this does not depict very well. Oh, this one might depict it a little bit better, but this one drops, and then it comes back up. You know, we got almost to zero. Unfortunately, this pest is also one that can have overlapping generations. And so what we're finding in many cases, and this makes control difficult, but what we're finding in many cases is that we'll get this flush and they'll feed, and we've got larvae out there that are anywhere from just hatching to 1.5 inches long. And that's difficult to get ahead of at that point. It's also very difficult to scout. They're difficult to control, everything. But keep in mind, we're trying to fine-tune this pheromone trapping network a little bit. It's one of those things that we're hoping to continue to formalize and find out maybe what those factors are that go along with this. Missouri has a good one. I have a link up there later for it. But there are some things that give us an early warning if we're not able to do the scouting ourselves. But we really need those guys in the South to do it as much as we do here. You know, one of the things, so there's an old, he's a retired entomologist from Department of Ag, and that is 100% what he said as well. He said, you get moisture, it's going to draw them in. Now, guys, I can't tell you exactly what that biology might be that they're drawn to, but we do know that when we get those moisture events, we get a flush of grass, right? And that's what they're attracted to. So yes, I think you're spot on. Now, I would have said that maybe those guys in East Central Kansas, based upon the moisture that came up through that Wichita area and kind of rolled through, I would have really thought they would have seen more down there, but it wasn't. It was predominantly a northern thing. Maybe that was temperature, I don't know, but you're spot on. I think moisture is a big, big factor for us. Great observation. These ones here at the end, again, I think that's the departure. I think that's we went north to Minnesota and now we're coming back through. And again, most of the entomologists would say that that is not a generation that we really need to worry about too much. But again, just knowing that maybe we're getting 2 or 3 flushes of those through the year. We also had just insane numbers to our south. Keep in mind, migratory pest. And so what happens is in the south is going to affect us. And so as those things get ahead of them down there, or maybe they get temperatures that are not attractive to them, or forage growth that is not attractive to them, those moths are going to continue to keep moving north. As systems move north, bring that moisture in, they're going to be associated with that as well. And so I don't know if you all paid attention to what, TV stations where they were reporting out of Wichita earlier this summer, but they got obliterated. Early summer, I mean June time period. They were in tough shape, and we just continued to get those kind of roll up. Now, I will say that, I complained, if you look at those pheromone trapping numbers, I complained a lot about, guys, these are the highest numbers. I've been doing this 3 years. These are the highest numbers I've ever collected. I might get 80 to 100 in a week, but these are the highest numbers I ever collected. There was places late in the season during the second flush out in Great Bend, 600 moths per week. That, again, we don't correlate that to damage necessarily, but we do know that there's just a mass of them out there, and this summer was that summer for us. Where do we go from here? I mean, that's kind of the big question. Hopefully, provide a couple things. One, maybe a few things to think about, and then, certainly discussion points as well. But I really think that we can probably now begin to evaluate stands. In 2021, we did these meetings in February, I believe. And the reason that we did them then is because we went through all that fall and didn't have a stitch of moisture and nothing regrew. And so we really didn't know what that was going to be like. But we've probably had enough moisture and a lengthy enough growing season that we can probably start to pick out some things now. And so I would encourage you, it maybe won't be the end-all be-all, but I would encourage you to maybe get out there now and start taking a look at those stands. I think there's a lot that we can see. We should have had time to recover. If you just take your boot, scrape along the ground, you'll get at least a first idea. If that forage doesn't kind of stick and grab, you'll be able to see. I think a better option, especially if you go out there and you've got spots that are as big as this room that really don't have much forage at all, or you've got just a few sprigs here and there, take a shovel and dig up some of those plants. I think that's going to be pretty important. I think by now we should be able to see some of what is going on. This link down here, again, that'll be in the presentation that we sent to you, but back in 2021, the guys in Frontier District had injury to stands bad enough that they had a group of plant pathologists come out, and they took roots back to the lab, and they looked at them under magnification. They looked at how they held together, and really the take home from those guys was, if you dig up that clump of soil and that soil really doesn't hold much to those roots, that was their correlation at that point was that root is probably doesn't have much life in it. So it's a good opportunity. Again, this is going to kind of muck things up for us, but as we get drier this fall or even this winter, ground's not frozen, go out there and dig some up. I think it could be a good exercise to give you an idea. And I'll show you some pictures about what to look at here in a little bit. Again, we can look at them under magnification, and if you want to do that, you want to take a picture on your phone and blow it up. Obviously we're looking for, something with some color, some, whitish cream color to it. But those roots will often have kind of a dark color to them anyway, so it's a little bit hard to tell. Again, under big magnification we can sometimes see in, but I think digging up those plants and looking at what is under there is the big thing. I've never seen a very good rule of thumb for if you go out there and say, I have X number of plants per square foot, or I have X amount of canopy cover, to keep or get rid of it, because that's really, in a lot of cases, what we're trying to figure out is, well, we're going to keep this standard, we're going to get rid of it, we're going to interseed, how are we going to manage this? I don't really have one. There's one out of maybe somewhere in the south that said 50%. If you go out there and you have 50% ground cover or less, then it's probably time to do something different. But I'll show you a slide here in a minute. I'm not sure that's 100% true for us, but it's, again, there's an art and a science to grazing, and an art and a science to grass growth, and this is kind of the art of it. You're going to have to kind of take a look at it and figure out how I want to manage that, what I'm willing to put into it. But again, every stand is going to be a little bit different. Dig up some plants, start to see what you have. The upper left is what you might see. You might pull that soil out and there's not much there. Everything's just sort of crumbly. It falls apart, doesn't stick to the roots, don't have any good color to them. That's not a good sign. What I would really start to be looking for, though, is, look at those roots, and obviously this is a plant that has something growing on it, so we know it's alive. But look at those roots and see if you see any of these new shoots starting. Look and see if there's anything like this that's just poking out. That's kind of the indicator that we should have. Was told by a grower this summer that they didn't have anything one fall. They poured a bunch of fertilizer on, and next year they had a great grass stand. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But I would suggest that if we don't see, some soil that's sticking to those roots, a little bit of decent color to it, maybe even some shoots now and again, and it hasn't recovered by this time, that I'd be pretty concerned about what that looks like. In fact, that's an area that if I'm out there and I'm mapping it, or I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to need for seed, I'm probably drawing a circle around that area and saying this is a candidate for maybe doing something different. I would also say that don't give up, but it's going to be a little bit of a climb. So in 21, I went out in the fall and dug some plants up, or dug some clumps of soil up, and just put them in a plastic container, kept them watered and under some window, light and heat all winter long. And you can start to see a little bit of recovery. So if you're concerned and you want to dig some clumps up, you want to kind of grow out something like that, you can find that out. This was one area of the field. It came back fairly decent, but this is another area of the field. And you can see that all that came back is weeds. Like I say, I don't think that you'll need to do that to any degree this year, because I think we've had time for this to occur naturally. So if you're seeing this out there, I'm quite frankly relatively confident that it's not coming back. We'll see. I hope I'm wrong, but we'll see. I would guess that you could ask people that have seen this as well, and I think we could probably develop a lot of theories. My theory is this: in areas where maybe we had good growth, maybe a draw that had just a little bit of moisture in it, maybe along a tree line where it was shaded and a little bit cooler, those areas were where it was attractive for the egg laying initially. I can tell you that on my farm, they started in a draw and moved up the hill. In many places, I have growers that talk about they're coming out of that tree line every year. Now, the entomologist will tell you that they're not necessarily they're not staying in the trees or anything like that. That's not their life cycle. But I do think it provides a temperature and moisture environment. So that's my correlation, is temperature and moisture environment. Now, I'll show you a picture here in a little bit of a spot that's right out in the open and really droughty. But the difference is that all the grass around it had grown back to the point it wasn't attractive, and that grass, because it was droughty, was slow enough So it's going to vary a little bit. It's just kind of what stage that grass is when that moth comes in and where it lays it. Yeah, good question. Now, what I also can't tell you is this. I can't tell you why they just ate on this so much that it just killed it versus this that came back, because I don't have any numbers of what their feeding was from any of those areas or anything like that. I have a little bit better numbers this year, but in that particular situation, I don't know how much they ate or didn't eat. That's a good question. So I talked to you a little bit about the canopy cover. You can get a picture with your phone. You can put it in, take it to a website called Canopeo. You can put it in there and it'll give you a biomass cover. I think that these are good, but I don't know as I would use it to make a decision on a stand. So on this is 4 spots on my place. This is an area that is so-so. I would say that it's probably average to below average condition after the feeding this summer. 2 is terrible. That's one of those spots that just got fed on over and over and over again. It was the droughty spot. That, you can see that it just did not recover well. Number 3 down here is probably the best spot on the whole farm after feeding. And it never even got much, it didn't even get to 35% coverage. But what they do allow you to do is if you're trying to get an idea across the stand of what are my differences, how many do I have of this area versus this area, sometimes our eyes lie to us a little bit, right? I mean, I'm going to tell you guys, when I walked out and saw the first flush of these things this summer, you can get pretty discouraged pretty fast. This gives you a way to step back a little bit. I take a picture, I put it in there. How much is there really cover out there? So again, wouldn't use it to necessarily make a hard, fast stand decision, but I do think they can tell you a little bit about how that stand is responding. And again, how different things are out there. This site 4 up here, just as correlation between these two, this looks a whole lot worse than this does, but still, did not recover nearly as fast. Did not come back. And I took these I didn't even start these till September. This is kind of after that, kind of during the middle of that second flush. That's when these all got taken. So after we've kind of gone out there and evaluated that stand a little bit, I'm going to leave most of this to Ross later on to talk about some other options. But I do think that we need to take a hard look at what our forage complement might be. I like brome grass. It gives us a lot of options to do a lot of things. And so if you want to return to brome, I'm not going to argue with you at all. I do think that as you look at that, though, just kind of keep these things in mind. You're going to have limited production next year. If you decide you're going to reseed that, overseed that, whatever you're going to do, it's going to be limited production. It does still fit well in our system because it probably matches what's out there, especially if we've got kind of a hodgepodge of a stand. But it is still going to be susceptible to feeding. Now in the south, they talk about it eating fescue. I've talked to our range people and they'll tell you it'll eat native grass. I don't know what you guys have seen, but the 2 places that I have seen at the absolute worst, other than lawns, I mean, I think lawns are usually short enough that they'll eat about anything in lawn. Cover crop seedings, new cover crop seedings, and brome grass. I've seen them eat up a hill, go around the fescue plants, get to the native grass, stop and move on somewhere else. So we don't seem to be seeing that pressure in those. And so that takes me to the second point. Maybe I don't want to keep fighting this thing. Because even that new seeding that you do this year is going to be fairly susceptible to them again next year. So if you're thinking, well, I'd really like to do something different, I think it's a good time to start looking at that forage system. Optimal time would have been after the last time, but it's time to start thinking a little bit about what our perennial forage grass system might look like. Can we do some things that give us a different harvest window, that give us some different grasses? I think if you were to talk to Ross and start looking at some ration stuff, he'd probably be able to tell you pretty quick, even without you telling what forage you used, what forage you were grazing when, based upon the quality of some of those at different times of the year. We've got some options to be able to do that. Maybe you want to transition to an annual forage. Some of you maybe have done that already. Annual forages are also going to be susceptible to this pest, especially in the early seeding stages. I mean, if we go in with a cereal rye or something like that, they can mow that down just the same as they can brome. But it does give us an opportunity to maybe look at some different windows, maybe push some production. And I think it's also important to consider that as we are maybe looking at, are we even going to have enough forage to get us through the next year? I can't tell you exactly how much forage loss that you're going to have, how much productivity loss you're going to have, But I would start thinking in my mind now that you are going to have to deal, if you're in a pasture situation or a hay situation, you are going to deal with less forage next summer than you did this summer. That's just, in most of these cases where they got fed on fairly well, I think that's going to be the case. Maybe you're going to exit forage production altogether. We could have a whole meeting on talking about you buying hay versus raising your own hay, about what the economics are of that going to something else. And I'm not a proponent for taking grassland out of production. Some of it shouldn't be out of production. Some of it can't be out of production. But the economics of this thing at some points gets to, how am I going to manage this stand going forward? And I think that's an option to think about as well. Don't like it, but it is the way it is. So I like the first one up there. I like going back to brome. I think that gives us a lot of flexibility of some things, but it is going to be susceptible to it, and I think we just need to think about that. I would even say that it's probably one of those things that we need to think about from a budgetary standpoint, thinking about budgeting for an insecticide on a fairly regular basis. It's just the way it is. After you kind of settle on what you're going to do, and we'll talk about some stopgap stuff here in just a little bit, but after you've kind of decided what you're going to do, I think you can probably go out there and start getting a pretty good idea even now of what you're going to need for acreage to be replanted. I think you need to start looking at planting windows. This is one for brome grass. We've got different ones for all kinds of forages. You'll get different stories sometimes on what those are, but we've got a wide window that we can do some things. And I'm not, a lot of times people tell me, well, I've planted brome and ... and it worked out just fine. You know what? You can plant something just about any time you want to, and sometimes it'll work. If we would have planted, I had somebody call me around the first day of October and ask this year about planting brome. And my advice was, based upon what we know about fall weather, I would not do that, because you might get just enough grass up that it freezes off and then it doesn't come back. You expended all the energy in that little seed to get a shoot up out of the ground, and you froze it off, and now it's done. But had he planted it on November 20th, he's probably got a decent stand, right, this year. So keep that in mind. These are guidelines. You can try a lot of things. I've had a lot of people talk about the opportunity to plant some stuff in dormant season. I think that can work well. Just keep in mind that as you're looking at those planting windows, not just the dates on there, but also looking ahead to what you think weather's going to be. We need to get a grass plant up out of the ground with 2 to 3 leaves on it before we frost it, okay? If we don't have that, it probably hasn't put enough energy back into that root system to give it survivability. And so that's what you're weighing. Grass seed is not inexpensive, and so be careful as you're doing that to make sure that you're doing that. This is also an opportunity, I think, as we try to figure out what we're going to do to plant. I'm a huge proponent of soil sampling. I'll talk about that later in this presentation. But if you've got a place that maybe has kind of been on the cusp of not being in very great shape anyway, I think you probably better get a soil test, start to think about some fertilizer applications. Phosphorus, in particular, a little bit of nitrogen, can go a long ways towards really kind of proliferating some of these cool season grass plants. I would suggest as well that we have got a terrible problem with potassium, where our potassium levels are starting to deal like this. So make sure that we're applying some fertilizer out there to put it in good shape. And then again, scouting next summer. These areas that we reseed are going to be the most susceptible to feeding injury next summer. I think that goes without saying, and so we need to be aware of that as we go forward. Again, we've got options. If there's what's called the Kansas Crop Planting Guide. If you want what all of our guidelines are for forages, they're all in there, but you're going to get a map similar to what this one is right here. Okay, so I entitled this Stopgap Measures, and I don't think that's a really crummy title. My point was really to throw up there, what are some of the pros and cons of maybe throwing something else out there, another forage out there. So these are the ones that I came up with when I finished this presentation earlier this week. After I get done today, I'll probably have half as many more to add or subtract. But we do have the opportunity, if we want to fill in with another type of forage. So I'm not talking about going back with what you already had, in most cases brome grass. I'm not talking about going back with that. I'm really talking about what are some other things that maybe we would want to potentially consider going forward. Do we want to just fill this in? And what are the pros and cons of that? So I guess some of the pros of that are, maybe we want to just throw something out there. We don't want to go to the investment of brome seed out there on some of these bad areas. Maybe we want to go with something, maybe plant some oats next spring or something like that to just fill in there, give us a chance to look at our fertility program, maybe give us a chance to implement some weed control if we need to. That may be a longer term thing than 1 year, but I do think there are some opportunities that we can do that on the pro side and fill in those production areas. So I will use my place as an example. So I've got some areas, some triangles out there, some squares out there that are about half as big as this room. I don't have any brome seed purchased yet. Was waiting to see what was going to happen with them. What are my options going in there? I could go in there again with some oats or something along those lines, fill in those areas. It would harvest, give or take, about the same time as what brome would, and I could take that off at that point, and then I can go back, rinse and repeat next fall. Get my fertility in order, get weed control in order, those sorts of things. That's going to be different for every parcel. Actually, when I did this presentation initially, my thought was, I'm going to get so that you have a recipe. This is the recipe that you should follow to get where you're going to go. And there's just too many recipes because each of you have a little bit different situation. Those are on the pro side. On the con side, what I think you have to consider is this. If you are not going to go back with that same forage, you have to keep in mind that there are going to be differences in growth stage, right? There's going to be differences in maturity of those. There's going to be could be some differences in growth requirement. Brome's a cool season plant. Oats are cool season, but if you decide, well, I'm going to do a summer annual instead, now you're throwing two different growth seasons out there, and that can complicate things. I think that can be an issue. If you don't go back immediately with the forage that you're planning to go with out there, obviously that is going to delay our return to normal. And so in many cases, I like the idea of looking at it in the spring and going, I can get brome in on February the 10th. I'm just going to do that. I'm going to roll with that. I think that I can manage the weeds. I think I've got a good fertility base underneath it already. I'm just going to go with that. But if you want to go with something else like that, keep in mind that there's going to be some differences out there that you're going to have to manage. I also think that you have to keep in mind a little bit, what am I introducing for competition? And this is probably the biggest one that you are going to have to evaluate if you decide that you're going to interseed something. So I talked about those areas that were maybe half as big as this room that are completely blank. Those can be a fairly straightforward decision because we want something out there. So we decide it's not terribly weedy. I think my fertility base is good. I've got a window in February. Boom, I plant brome and I walk away. If you step back from that and go, well, the stand is about 25% or so. I don't know what that's going to be. Man, if you decide that you're going to plant brome in there or you decide that you're going to plant something else in there, keep two things in mind. One, the plant that is already growing out there has the competitive advantage. I don't care if that's the brome plant. I don't care if that's the weed that's out there. It has a competitive advantage over anything that you are going to seed. So that perennial grass plant already has a root system. It is going to take nutrients and light generally faster than anything else around it is going to. If you put a bunch of money into seed and expect something to just take off and grow and for them to just magically mesh together and complement each other perfectly, that's not generally the way it goes, okay? In the blank spots, you'll get some forage out there, but generally those ones that are trying to compete with each other, we've got competition, and that's not always a great thing. So keep that in mind. The second thing is let's say that we introduce a forage out there. And I use this example because, and we've tried it in the past, and I'm not going to tell you that it won't ever work because I've seen it work. But let's say that you go out there in the summer and you say, man, he was right. This was a really thin stand. My production was really low. I'm going to have to reseed in the fall, but I'd really like to get something out here now. And you go and you throw a summer annual forage out there or something along those lines. Keep in mind that that plant is going to grow at a different cycle than the plant that you introduced it into. Even if you were to throw oats out there that's growing at the same time as that brome will, one of the concerns that you have is, am I harming my perennial plant that I want to recover by introducing something in there? And so I'm pretty cautious about this from that standpoint, but again, it's going to be a case-by-case basis where you go out there and go, this is just not enough to keep. I'm going to have to do something with it. I might as well interseed something. And I will say this, I do think there are some times that if you look at that partial stand, you can baby that thing along for a long time, and it's just a challenge to ever get it to fill back in. So just kind of keep that in mind. It may be better to go with one of these at that point. I don't like filling the gaps with those things, but if you've got spots out there and you say, man, I'd really like to fill this in and get me to a fall planting, there are some things I think you can throw out there. Ross is going to have a list of these as well that you might want to consider, maybe in a little bit different context, but there's tools like this. This is the Midwest Cover Crops tool. It's got some options that if you wanted to go in there in February, there's some of these here that you could still kind of throw out there and seed and maybe get some forage growth. Again, a lot is going to depend on spring moisture. A lot's going to depend on what we have for competition out there to begin with. If you do have what I would even say is a semi-decent stand, I get a little bit hesitant about doing this. At the very least, keep seeding rates pretty low in those situations so you're not competing terribly. I told you I was a big proponent of soil sampling. I can't do a forage program without talking about soil sampling because in our cool season systems, it's probably one of the largest hurdles we have to getting and keeping good stands. These are some fertility removal rates. I don't know if I have the nutrient, cost numbers quite correct. I had some guy tell me yesterday, yeah, it's closer than you'd like to think. And it's expensive, right? It's expensive to fertilize that hay crop out there. Again, back 10, 12 slides ago when we talked about some of those forages, one of the things I didn't talk to you about is, what if we went to a native grass system? We don't seem to have fall armyworms in those systems. They don't require near as much fertilizer as brome grass. There's options out there that we need to consider, but if we're going to have brome grass out there, we're going to have a cost associated with that fertilizer. These are some removal rates over here, give or take. Every farm responds a little bit differently. But when you think about trying to, get a good fertilizer program out there, it's going to cost something to do that. I'm a big proponent of soil sampling. I think in a lot of cases, I've preached about phosphorus fertility for 20 years. I think we need to start talking more about potassium fertility as well. Seeing a lot of soil samples coming back with, potassium rates that are half what we would consider are even good for maintaining a stand, let alone that stand thriving. Go out and get a soil sample. It's a good thing to do. Get that fertilizer on in a timely manner. Obviously, we don't want to put on anything to frozen ground, so avoid that this winter. But getting some fertilizer out there so that we can, get kind of into the root system and get that going. I think it's a good time as well. We need to start probably taking a look at adding some lime on some of these stands. Get a soil sample and find out exactly what that is. I throw this up there because I think it's important. Sometimes people say, well, you told me to put fertilizer on. And again, it's easy for me to say that. It's easy for me to stand up there and say that because I'm not paying the bills that you guys are to make that happen. But I do think that if you're looking at that and going, I think I can get by one more year, or I think it's not as bad as what I might think. This is the probability of response for soil tests under a 12 part per million. So in our K-State soil testing lab, when we get a soil test back that is below 20 parts per million phosphorus, we're going to make a phosphorus recommendation to some degree based upon that soil test level. It's based on response curves, and we know that if we are in that 10 and below range, we have a very high likelihood that we're going to respond to that fertilizer. Keep that in mind as you're trying to kind of allocate that fertilizer dollar a little bit. I think there's a pretty good opportunity to get a response out of fertilizer. Again, I don't know as you're going to fertilize your way out of this, but I do think it's good to have that those fertility levels up. Now, if you decide for some reason that you are going to go into a native grass system, I still think a soil sample is a good thing, but if you're thinking about, am I going to keep this in cool season or am I going to keep this in warm season, make sure that you're telling your lab which one of those you're going to do, because those are going to be drastically different fertility rates, fertility recommendations going forward, okay? So keep that in mind. One soil testing tip that I would give you is or two soil testing tips, I guess. Get plenty of cores per subsample. If you want to grid sample it, fine. If you want to zone sample it, fine. If you're going to composite sample it, fine. But make sure that you're getting adequate number of cores for that sample. If we're out there and we're getting taking a farm and we go out there and we get 2 shovels full and throw it in a bucket, we're clear over here, and we come back with a 12 part per million phosphorus, there's plus or minus 7 parts per million variability around that number. We don't know out there. We might have 5, might have 19. That's a difference of a recommendation of 35 pounds versus 10 pounds, okay? To get an accurate number, you need to make sure that you're getting a good number of samples. And the other thing is depth. I think it's important to keep a consistent depth as you go through there, keeping in mind that as we fertilize most of these systems, we're doing so on the surface, right? We're not getting any, we're surface applying in these forage systems. There's probably some level of stratification. And if we go out there and we shove a probe in the ground and it's dry and we only get to 3.5, 4 inches, and we say, oh, that's good enough, we might be overcompensating or over collecting the nutrients that are actually in that. So get a 0 to 6 inch sample, make sure that's a consistent sampling depth, and try to get that taken care of. And then get good interpretations. Ask, if you're running it through us, ask me. If you're running it through your retailer, ask them. Get a good explanation of what that number means. It's not, all the labs are good. All the labs have great information, but sometimes we come at recommendations from a different angle. And so find out what that recommendation really means and go from there. For example, if you ask our lab to give you a soil test recommendation, it's going to be on a sufficiency level for forages. It is going to be, we want the last unit of fertilizer to respond. If you're trying to do a build program, or if you're trying to enhance a farm, or you're saying, man, I really do not ever want this farm to ever be behind in production, there might be labs that are running that and giving you a different number. That's okay. Just find out what that interpretation is. I said it before, I'll say it again. So this is, again, I took some of those clumps back in 2021. I put them in there. I put on, I think it was about the equivalent of 100 pounds of 1846-0. So just a little dab of fertilizer on this. That grass that was out there, it really didn't get it to respond very much. Had I done that in August or September, might have been completely different, right? I threw fertilizer out 2 times this fall. I threw, one set out after I had, equivalent of 100 pounds of 1846-0 on a small tract after the first flush, and I did it again after they were done for the year in a separate spot. So far, not seeing any difference at all. I'm looking forward to next spring, but I think we need to fertilize. I just don't think that's a silver bullet. I don't think it's the end-all be-all. I'd be remiss to not say anything about weed control, because I do think weed control is going to be something that we're going to have to in a lot of cases, I think that needs to be part of our budget if we haven't been doing it before. I think it's probably going to be one of those things we're going to have to give a pretty hard look at going forward, because these stands they're not in a very competitive state. And as much as I really don't want to have to add that to the budget, I think we're going to have to take a really hard look at it this next year. And there's some cautions I would give you on that, but I just think we need to start looking at what some of those products and application timings might be. So this is mine in 2024. You can see over there, this stand got eaten off pretty decent. And that was kind of a combination of grasshoppers. Ross talked a little bit in the meetings the last couple of days about how, in some cases, had as many grasshoppers early as he did probably anything. I think that's true. But this got mowed off in a small area. You can see the weeds over here. You can see them up close a little bit over there. Doesn't look too good. It was a small area. I found it. I decided that I'm not going to do anything for an acre. I'm an extension. We love to have little test plots, right? We're just going to leave it. We're going to see what happens. So I followed it all winter long. I took green seeker readings from both the good areas and the bad areas around it. And there's some differences. Even tried to add water. It was dry enough last fall that I even tried to irrigate a plot. Didn't really see too much difference. We're going to have those things out there that we're going to have to think about. So I kind of split this into a couple different sections. One, decent stands. I think if you've got a weed control program that's already in place, I certainly wouldn't cut that out now. I think it's going to be important that we stay on top of those weeds out there. Again, trying to keep plants from taking over that we don't want competing with what we want out there. I threw these up there because these are some of our common ones, and these are some of our common, products that we maybe will use. Talk to your retailer, see kind of what they're seeing as well. Maybe you've got some experience of your own. Everybody's got a little bit different experience. But what I will say is this. 2 things, I guess. One, different plants are going to require different active ingredients, or there's going to be different responses to those. We know those. One of the hardest things that I think is when you get that call and somebody says, well, I've got weeds, I want to just take care of them all. That's a pretty hard recipe to find without putting a bunch of money into a lot of different products. But take a look out there this spring, see what you have. If you've got a decent stand and you've got a good weed control program, this is probably not when I would skimp on that. I will say, however, this. Those plants are, in some cases, pretty sensitive. They're going to be regrowing. And so if we go out there with a product that has the potential to maybe cause some injury, and this doesn't happen every year, but sometimes the longer residual products maybe cause some damage from time to time, just be cautious of that and know what you might be up against in some of those cases. I like those products. I think they do a great job. I even like some of the impregnated fertilizers. But sometimes some of those products can, because of their residual, because of the active ingredient that they are, we hear from time to time some injury. And on these sensitive plants, that might be a possibility. That said, there's some of these up here that it doesn't matter how safe they might be. If you apply that to a plant that's under stress, it's going to be a problem anyway. And so kind of keep that in mind as well. Just know that when you add that herbicide application, that plant is going to have a response to that. And if it's a stress situation, you might see some of that injury. If you've got a thin, maybe a struggling stand, if the recovery is pretty good, I think you can go back and kind of do what you normally had. But if not, and you think that you're going to be doing any reseeding, I guess what I would really start to take a look at is the product that I was going to apply out there going to cause me a herbicide restriction? Is it going to cause me a replanting issue if I apply that out there? So let's say that I go out there and I say, well, I'm going to seed some brome, and then I'm going to turn right around and I'm going to put my fertilizer on with some weed control. There could be a response in some cases that is not very good at that point. That grass may have to get to a certain height. We may have to have a certain time frame from the time we apply that herbicide to the time that we're willing to go out there and apply that. So if you're doing that, just be cautious of those plant back intervals. I'll show you a chart on that in just a little bit. My other suggestion would be is if you go out there and you start to look at it and go, this thing is just probably not coming back, I'm probably in the camp of let's just apply some non-selective, non-residual product, and let's just kill what's out there, and then we can go back and reseed. I think that might be a better option at that point. You just kill everything and you start over. So just note those label restrictions and make sure that you're following them. In a lot of cases, if you're working with a retailer on that or somebody that's applied these a lot over time, they'll have a pretty good idea as well. But just note that label is kind of is out there for a reason, and it's to kind of keep you from dinging stuff that you don't want to ding. This is a herbicide carryover chart. It just shows kind of the difference. If you've got a product like Milestone out there, the plant back interval is a year. And so if those products have been applied out there, I'm not going to tell you that if you applied those last spring and you go out this spring and seed that you won't get away with it just fine. But just keep in mind, those products sometimes take time to break down. There's some of them that you can go out there, 2,4-D, 30-day plant back interval. Just keep those in mind. And that may make a difference on what you apply this spring or what you go out there and plant, and then maybe what you're waiting on this fall. So a few thoughts as we get it, as kind of wrap up here just a little bit and hand it over to Ross. So this is September 24. I showed you the weeds in that stand earlier. Again, I didn't do anything with that. I just sort of let it go. I thought this is going to be fun. And this is what it turned out like. So this is the area that did not have any feeding. This is the area that did. Difference, right? You can see a heading difference, delayed heading. In some cases, that to the left didn't get any heads on it ever at all. It was cleaner. I mean, if you were to walk across this and this, there's no weeds out here at all. That grass came back very vigorously. It was very competitive. It looked very well. Now, it looks like trash again at the end of 2025 because it got fed on again. But there is the possibility that they'll recover. I think if you went out this fall, and then some of you all may not be in the situation where you just got brown ground out there or just a few sprigs. Some of you may just be looking and go, man, it's just really thin. It looks a little rough. If you had a chance for that grass plant to come back at all this fall and get a few leaves on it, I really expect this is what you may see more than anything. Won't be ideal, definitely lost production, but there'll be something out there. Maximize recovery potential. Again, we talked all about fertility. We talked about weed control. Just keep in mind that plant is a dynamic system, and we need to make sure that we are growing below ground and above ground. Keeping things above ground, I'm not going to get into the grazing realm too much, but guys, when we're talking harvest height and we remove 90% of a plant's growth, we might stop growth of that root system for a couple of weeks. And so if we're looking at these stands and we're thinking, man, this thing's really kind of stressed to begin with, do we need to change how we're going to put an animal out there? Do we need to change? I'm pretty big on cutter bar height. Do we need to start looking at some of those to try to give that plant every chance of recovery? I think that we, in the past, have been very spoiled and that we could harvest and it would just come back, right? Put a little fertilizer to it, everything worked phenomenal. But you don't get 3 out of 5 years of drought stress in the fall. You don't get 3 out of 7 years with fall armyworm feeding in the summer, and it just continue to do that. So give that grass plant every chance to thrive. And again, I think that's important because it's a systematic approach. It's from the fertilizer you apply to the weed control that you apply to the forage that you're putting out there and how you're managing it during harvest. It's a systems approach, and I think we need to start thinking about that. Take a look ahead at weather. That we can't do a doggone thing about it, but it does give us a look into, do we think we're going to be able to get anything done as we get ready to go to seeding? But really, the things that I also think you need to keep in the back of your mind is this. From the weather standpoint, we sometimes, I think, are dinging our brome a little bit in the spring with some freeze injury, cold injury late. We can't let a plant get up and growing very well in February and then have it get too cold in May, and we can cause some damage that way. This is rust. Brome is a grass plant. It gets rust on it. We're not going to spray it, right? That doesn't make any sense economically. But if that plant goes into fall and photosynthetic capacity is restricted because it's covered in disease, we need to just understand that is going on out there and understand how that might affect the plant. And these are my final thoughts, I guess. Again, start evaluations now. I don't think it's too early to do that. In fact, I'm at the point that if you were to ask me today, I'd say while you're out there doing that stand evaluation, if you're going to be reseeding some areas or you're trying to make a decision, I'd start, recording those now, because I think we know what that is to be able to do. I think we need to start looking, whether we're doing it now or down the road, look at a whole farm forage inventory. We would be glad to have that discussion with you. I think that's a place that we need to be looking further down the road about how we're going to manage these forages going forward. Take care of those other management factors. And I put this chart in there, this insecticide chart. This was a trial that was done 3 or 4 years ago. I put it up there for 2 reasons. One, insecticides do work. Now, we can argue a lot about which ones work better and which ones don't, but insecticides, I believe, do work, and they can be effective against this pest if we apply the right product, the right time, the right rate with plenty of carrier, okay? But do we need to be thinking about budgeting for an insecticide application at least on a more frequent basis than we are now? There's some of these products that you're getting on for $2 to $3 an acre before application cost. There's some of them that are 3, 4, 5 times that much. We can talk about those, but we need to start thinking at the very least about, are we going to put that in a budget as we go forward? That may make a difference on what you do for a whole farm forage inventory as well. These forages are very resilient, but a little help is going to go a long, long way. And so I think that anything that you can do now, fertility management wise, thinking about weed control, get on the front side of that. We talked about the whole insecticide, and this is a whole list of registered products. Again, we've got some anecdotal stuff. We've got some experience with them. We've got a lot of different things that go into which ones of these work and don't work. In fact, I would say that if you were to line people up, there'd be people over here that would say, man, that product worked good and I would never use anything else. And I've got people telling me that I will not ever go out there again without a product that's got a pretty long residual. And so my point is not to, say use this product or not use this product. My point is start to explore those products now. There are differences, at least from what we are seeing out there, in this product versus this product versus some of these lambda-ci products. There's differences in how they responded out there. Now, in some cases, it's because of the year we had and the number we had and the overlapping generations that we had. And some of it, it's because of we're maybe not applying, as optimally as we should. But start to think about what that product might look like for you. Talk to your retailers. See what they found. talk to us. We'd be glad to tell you what we found. Again, we've got trials. We need to do more, but we've got some trials that talk about some of those products, but start to take a look at these products and see what they might do. I will say this, and I'm going to let Ross talk about this a little bit more. Ross, if you want to go ahead and pull your ears up, we'll get going. But one of the things I will say about this is I do think that you need to make sure that you understand what that label says. And Ross is going to talk about it in a little bit here, but some products are pretty vague. And so exploring what that product says and getting some, and that's not anybody's fault except the company's. The people that are selling those products at the wholesale level or the company level, the manufacturer level is what I mean. But we need to understand what those products are because they do have ramifications to what we can do out there. So we'll answer some questions at the end. I want to hand it over to Ross real quick and we'll let him get on his way.
Okay. Thank you, David, and appreciate everybody coming out. I am sincere in saying this because he won't say it, but the expert is in the room. There's probably nobody in Northeast Kansas on the extension side that has done more work in fall armyworm discussion than what David has. And so I do encourage you, if you have your questions, to bounce it off of him. He's done a lot of research and a lot of anecdotal things. I think both David and I are going to talk a little bit about practical experience that we have had with fall armyworms as well. I'm going to kind of come at things a little bit more from a grazing standpoint. But I think, we've seen a lot of different things. This is a frustrating pest for sure. David had mentioned that we talked about this last in kind of 21, 22, that time frame. What I had talked about at that point in time was looking at if we don't have, because we know that following armyworm infestation, we're not going to have the brome production the next year. It just isn't. And so the focus of what I had talked about last time was what are some of the alternatives to brome, and in terms of feeding cow herds, and what might we need to look at. The environment's a little bit different. Paul will tell you, right? You've got hay for sale. There's plenty of hay out there this year, even though it wasn't maybe necessarily a great hay year. There's a lot of those alternatives. So I'm not going to go down that road, but I do want to play off a little bit of what David had kind of talked about. Be remiss if I didn't start talking, though, again, looking at this a little bit more from the grazing standpoint. It comes into play, though, too, if you're running a swather across it. The carbohydrate root reserves. That's going to be a critical thing. It's the bank account down there, and you'll see on that slide up there on the left that after you take a plant off, whether it's again with a swather or with an animal, as David said, you can shut the plant down if you're harvesting a lot of that photosynthetic area. And if you continue to leave a plant in a place where it doesn't have photosynthetic tissue, you're robbing from that bank account. You're stealing those carbohydrate reserves, and that's only going to just diminish those stands, whether it's, probably looking at this here in a pasture setting. So we really do need to let plants regrow to that kind of 2-3 leaf stage. And in a brome setting, the rule of thumb is ankle to knee. You want to make sure that you've got brome out there at least at your ankle and upwards of your knee in a pasture setting. The other slide talks about just rest, and I think that's the big thing in a grazing setting again. Plants need rest as much as anything. And so the faster the plant's growing, the slower the amount of time or the fewer days you need to rest. If it's a slow growing plant, you need time to let those plants rest. And in this setting, and we saw it this fall, David said he likes brome. I don't like brome. I love brome a few months out of the year, and I hate brome most of the rest of the year. And so it's a plant that I have a love-hate relationship with. But I do think that it is a plant that we see, we noticed that this fall with fall armyworm damage, we had some regrowth, and we hate it. We had some regrowth, and the armyworms come, and they clipped it down to nothing. And then it regrowed or tried to again, and then we had another wave of fall armyworms. Just think about how much we're taking out of that plant's carbohydrate root reserves and everything that David talked to you about in terms of weed management and fertility and all those sort of things. So what my approach is going to be is, and I've just got a few slides to look at, but if you are not going to go back with a brome, If you want to take it out of production, or you've got spots that you're going to try to fill in with something else, what are the options that we can look at in terms of replacing brome? Or maybe this is, again, that stopgap measure to get you back into a better time of year to reseed brome. And really, it boils down into those four things. We're looking at annual plants, either cool season or warm season. We're looking at perennial plants that are either cool season or warm season. And I threw that grazing calendar up there. You know, and each one of these kind of tells you the different times where they're productive. Quite frankly, we go from February all the way through now into Christmas time, where we can have green tissue, live tissue out there. So, you know, January to February is probably the time where we struggle to get green matter, unless you're doing some stockpile forages or crop residues or those sort of things. It goes back to what David was discussing on that whole farm forage management issue. I think a mix of those plants is what you really want to see. I'm a grazer, and especially from a grazing standpoint, I think you need to have a little bit of all of those. So I'm just going to take a quick look here at positives and negatives, I guess, of those various plants. This isn't something that comes out of an extension publication. This is Ross's thoughts on what are pros and cons of each one of these things. So our cool season annuals, if you wanted to go back, and I'm mainly talking about cereal crops, our window is probably getting pretty narrow to maybe do any of that yet this fall, but if we're talking about trying to do a cereal rye, a triticale wheat, something like that in those bare spots, that's a possibility. I also have oats up there that would be more of a spring crop, barley, those kind of plants. And I'm really looking at, you know, the quality side of this and how that might affect, again, whole farm forage. These plants are really, you know, that seed's pretty cheap. You can put that out relatively on a reasonable basis. Generally high quality, particularly if you look at this slide. We're talking about all the way from boot to soft dough. Doesn't matter the plant, oat to wheat. We're in the 10 to 12, 13% or higher protein. Really good feed if you can get it before it goes to seed. When it's vegetative going to reproductive, really good quality there. So that's the high quality. You can rotate with warm season annuals as well. So let's say that you want to get back to a place where you want to try to sow some brome next fall, when it's a little, or late summer when it's a little better time to do that. You could go out there, put some cool season annuals out, follow that up with a warm season annual, and get you to a point where you've got some forage trying to get back to brome. Or that may just be your system, and that's sort of where I am, is just rotating these cool season annuals with warm season annuals. Kind of the downfall is there's a short grazing window on some of these. They want to rapidly put on seed heads at different times of the year, and so that quality decline occurs really quickly. And we can also run into nitrates, particularly as we look at things like oats. So again, just know that, I should say this too, David talked a lot about soil testing. If you're looking at forages that you maybe not use, especially if you're harvesting them, I would always encourage you to take a forage sample and just to see what our energy and protein values are on those. Because as this slide illustrates, if you go from boot to soft dough, you cut your protein in half, generally speaking. And the same is true on cool season perennials as well. We'll show in the next slide. Energy values on a lot of these go in the upper, kind of low to upper 50s, all the way up into the mid 60s. So really good energy values, again, if you're getting them kind of pre-reproductive stage. So I think that's an option with cool seasons. I'll say too that these are all grass plants. You can incorporate legumes, other types of broadleaves that are annuals as well, and I think that only, the more diversity you get, the better off you are in these grazing situations. This is a slide that came out of Alabama. I threw it on there because it did bring in some of the legumes, talking about cowpeas, sun hemp, forage soybeans. You know, I've had some experience with all of those really, really high quality kind of crude protein values and energy values as well. You know, all of those are up in the 60% TDN. So we're talking really good energy values. Crabgrass, grain sorghum, forage sorghums, pearl millets, all of those are options. It also up there shows you kind of yield per acre. You can get some really good tonnage out of our warm season annuals. So that's another thing to consider, again, if you've got spots that you're needing to fill in. Again, relatively cheap in terms of seeding rates on some of these, high quality, particularly early. And again, that rotation is a positive thing that can happen with cool seasons. You do have to be careful with particularly our sorghums that we run into nitrate accumulation issues. Prussic acid can be an issue as well. And so those are cautions that I would use around those. And also just the variation in plant parts. Here a couple years ago, worked with a producer, was running into some nitrates, like off the chart nitrates. And so did some work where we measured just the leaf as well as whole plant versus stalk. Leaves generally are not very high in nitrate, but his stalk was extremely high. So, and then that leads into the whole utilization thing as well. You know, cows are just not going to like the stalks as much as they like leaves. That's just the way that is. And so, got to be a little bit careful with that. But I think a good option, particularly if you're, maybe even get into April, May timeframe and like they just don't have enough brome here, this would be an option that you could put out there. So our cool season perennials, again, mainly looking at grasses in this setting. Started with brome up there. These generally, again, are high quality plants, particularly if you harvest them at the right time. There's the 2 periods of vegetative growth. Most all of these plants, you're going to see an early spring growth, and then again that fall growth period, which are positives to all of those plants. There is the nitrogen demand, the fertility requirements, as David discussed. That's sort of the downfall in my mind of C3 plants. But that is an opportunity to get high quality as well as high tonnage. If you look over here, the summer slump isn't a problem, on all those plants. They're cool seasons for nature. They're not going to do very well during the summer months. Hence my comments about hating them most of the summer. And then establishment costs, if you start getting into perennial reestablishment, you're going to run into more costs just in seeding than what you would on those annual type of plants. You can see a wide range there. Smooth brome is where we would start, 6 to 18%. Had a conversation here a week or so ago with somebody on what they thought was horse hay that was 6%. Just very frustrated that it was very low quality. Well, 6% brome is not uncommon. See a lot of that, 6 to 7 kind of percent proteins. That'll maintain a gestating cow all winter long. Not a problem necessarily there. But if you're shooting for a high percent protein, you're going to have to harvest really early. But you can get there with a lot of these plants. Again, good energy values. I guess the one thing that I would point out on this slide, there's orchard and timothy we don't see used a lot, more to the east of us they are, and those can be good complements if you're looking to go to something besides brome in a cool season perennial. David mentioned that thing about fescue. I kind of saw the same thing in a pasture setting. That the armyworms just don't seem to want to go to fescue, but he's got evidence that in other places that they do eat it. So I don't know. I'm not a huge fescue fan just in terms of some of the problems that might go with the endophyte fescue, but there is a huge potential and tonnage if you manage fescue right. There's the possibility that the armyworms would favor it less. If you're looking at going to a perennial cool season, you may want to look at fescue as an option if you're going to reseed some of these fields. I think tall fescue in a winter stockpiling is an excellent place to utilize that as well, looking at that whole farm forage issue. So, but just look at that wide range of protein and energy values. That can be a challenge with these plants as well. Looking at the warm season summer annuals, this comes out of the Noble Foundation, so work kind of Oklahoma and further south. Again, these are most often natives that are adapted to the warm season. They're C4 plants that are going to grow better during the summer months. They're deep-rooted, so most often you're not talking about applying fertilizer to these types of plants. So that's, again, a positive. And I'm as big a proponent of native grass as probably anybody, but they are expensive to get established. And you're going to give up production. You're going to have to be able to walk away from that for a few years and let those plants come into production. So they may not be a very logical place to go if you're looking for annual hay, that kind of thing. But if you're, again, looking at a whole farm situation where you might want to convert, this might be an opportunity to do that if you've got some places where there's been some really heavy armyworm damage. Some cost share money out there as well on some establishment of natives, so that would help with that. Spring lag is a problem with that, and then rapid quality decline. if you look at some of those plants out there, you'll see, like, I'll pick on eastern gamagrass. That's one I have some of, you know, from 3% protein up to 16%. That's a huge swing in protein. But it averages, you know, 8.2, really good stuff there. Just be aware of that these plants, especially when they start to put on seed heads, their quality is going to rapidly decline. So this is probably the point in time where I'll just give a little bit of my own personal experience. So there's an 80-acre parcel that I was dealing with armyworms on. It had some eastern gamagrass that we take for hay and then graze. They weren't in that. There's native grass hay meadow in there. Didn't see armyworms at all in that. The brome grass pasture that was there, where I had managed my grazing better and had regrowth that was closer to my knee, the armyworms weren't in that regrowth. Now down along the trees where the cows had ate too much and it was more that lush growth, the armyworms, it felt like, started there. The same thing that David's talked about, started along the tree line. I think it was just that's where the lush growth was. Completely mowed that off, moved into where the hay ground is on that portion, smooth brome hay, and cleaned that out. And in the bottom down there, I had planted cover crop. So it was a cereal rye, triticale, winter oats, peas, 2 types of brassicas kind of mix. And as I was out looking at the hay, I noticed, what in the world's going on down there? Well, I'll tell you what, fall armyworms love cereal rye, triticale, and black oats. They were cleaning that out as well. Now, they didn't touch the peas or the brassicas. So I only say that to say, I think if you can get diversity into your forage base, that might help you a little bit along this battle, if you will, with fall armyworms. Okay, I think that's probably all I have on that slide. The other thing that I wanted to point out before I turn it back over to David to kind of wrap everything up is we got into discussion, actually came from a veterinarian asking me about, are we seeing damage from insecticides? They were seeing, let me put it this way, they were seeing irritation to livestock that were still grazing in pastures that were sprayed. I think I could argue with, if you manage your grazing, you may not even need to be spraying pastures, but that's another conversation for another time. But in pastures that were being sprayed with livestock in them, products with a 0-day grazing restriction, they were seeing irritation, nostrils, lips, eyes of livestock. And so I hadn't really looked at, I tend to let that kind of work go to David, but I pulled up these labels. This one's Oklahoma's publication on what's labeled there. And I became rapidly confused as I was looking at some of these products, because some of them say 0-day grazing or harvest interval, but a 7-day wait for the last cutting of hay, or a re-entry of 3 days. Why do you have to wait to cut your hay, but you can spray it when the cows are in there or can graze it? It didn't make sense to me, and I still don't quite fully understand that. Long story short, I think even on those products that have 0-day grazing restrictions, I wouldn't spray if your livestock's out there. Worked with one producer that just said, I can't get the cows out. I said, well, can you manage it at all? Get them into a catch pen or something. So what they chose to do was to hold the cows on one side of the pasture. They were able to do that, sprayed. Then the next day came back, next morning sprayed the other half. They got along okay. I would just use caution. Most of these insecticides affect central nervous system of the insect. Cows have a central nervous system. You and I have a central nervous system. I just use caution, even on those that have a 0-day grazing restriction. And again, I think if you're managing your grazing right, you may not even have to spray, is sort of what I ran into. Would just encourage you that if you want to look at doing something beside brome, we can, as David mentioned, can talk to you about some of those options. So.
I think Ross and I are pretty well on the same page. I really like native grass in the system. I think it has a lot of potential. And Ross mentioned the cost share. So we spoke with a wildlife habitat biologist that kind of talked about, I mean, the amount of cost share out there is pretty tremendous. Oh, I guess I don't have it here. I like the opportunity. I think there's a big opportunity for cost share too. So I would explore that definitely. So that's one of the pros. And one of the things that I would say is that if you're going to do something, I think you need to do so. I mean, that seed's going to cost you somewhere probably north of $75 an acre to get into. I do, but I would be a little bit cautious from the standpoint of you sure don't want to be taking, I don't have enough experience to be able to tell you that just definitely will work. I have a little bit, Ross talks about love-hate relationship with brome. I have a little bit of a love-hate relationship with nurse crops like that. Because if it's a dry spring, that oats is probably going to take the vast majority of your moisture, and you may not like what you get. But yes, in theory, that would work very well to be able to come in and do that. And whether you're taking that off as a hay crop, you probably get by with it. I would just do a lighter seeding of the oats, obviously, half rate, third rate, something like that. Well, there's actually, if you look at, that's kind of the optimum, yes, but that's why I was going to try to show you this map here. So we're in this zone 2 up here. Getting something in even in March. It's going to establish faster, obviously, in that April timeframe, but yes, March. I did talk to our range management specialist a little bit, and she would feel comfortable, I think, even with dormant season applications. So like going out in December, January, going ahead and seeding that in. There's some of those broadleafs, legumes, those sorts of things that maybe need some, go through a little bit of a process in the winter where they're going to break that seed coat down and start to germinate. And so depending on what your mix is, the grasses aren't going to necessarily be that, but some of those broadleaf for flowers and stuff in there might be. So even doing some of that, which is what I would say even for anything. Again, we have these sort of rules, but what you're trying to do is get it in after everything's going to be dormant and is not going to grow, and then giving it a chance so that when it does start to grow, it can just sort of do this number right there. So yeah, you can see from this, we can get out there probably even in the early part of March. I would keep in mind as well that these are guidelines based upon probably, they're good guidelines, don't get me wrong, but you all know what our springs have been like of late. That we're sometimes getting a pretty warm stretch during the early part of the growing season, and then we get cold in May. So, keep that in mind as well. Establishment-wise, I think start clean. Obviously you're talking about a nurse crop maybe, and I think that's fine, but especially from the weed control standpoint or some of those, if at all you can, start clean. I think I just get really iffy about throwing grass out there or any crop out there without being fairly clean. And then just plan on it being a long-term sort of thing. It's going to be, you're going to have to kind of baby it for, I don't know. We used to tell people 2 to 3 years. The wildlife habitat specialist told me the other day, he said it might be 5 before you have much out there. And that's going to be weed control during that process. That's going to be probably some clipping. And that's going to be some pretty thin stands for a few years. But good, like I say, I like it drilled. I like a good, nice firm seed bed, kind of within these windows, and I like it clean to start if I can.
The only thing I'd add to that is diverse too.
Yes.
There's a lot of common that they want to throw 4 species at you. I'd say the more diversity, the better. Get side oats in there, add some gammas or some grandmas, get some legumes in it as well, native legumes.
I think that's a great point, and so I will say this on the insecticide side, as you're budgeting for that or as you're thinking about that, I think for a lot of years we've got by with insecticides that have done a pretty decent job. And I say pretty decent, again, as you start to talk to companies about efficacy trials, it's always I think you'd be curious if you ever got to talk to the people that were doing the research at the manufacturer level, what they see as good control or not good control. It might be kind of interesting. You might find that their definition of control is 75%. And so don't expect that you'll go out there the next morning and see everything dead. Now, I wouldn't walk out there anyway. There's a pre-entry or a re-entry interval on that product as well. And I had one grower this year that I walked on his farm and I said, "What are you doing?" "Well, I'm cleaning out the sprayer. I just got done spraying some armyworms this morning." He said, "Man, my eyes are really burning." They probably are. Stay out of that area. Give it some time. I think one of you mentioned that, you're not going to maybe see something for a few days. That's really true. Let that product work. I will say this, tell you this story. I went out and I had done an application. So I did an application of a generic lambda-cy. Tickled, just thrilled with it. Did not get the whole farm sprayed, which I would also say, don't ever do that. Spray the thing. Don't try to find the area. Just spray it and walk away. You're going to be a whole lot better off. This is some imagery from my place. That's satellite imagery. We can talk about that a little bit if you want. But basically, it's trying to get at this whole thing of, can we catch something with aerial imagery before we catch it ourselves? I'm not sure we can, but it's kind of a cool concept. But, if I'm ever going to find, nope, right there. So you can't see it great, but they started right down in this draw down here and started moving up that hill. And so that's where I went first. I just started at an angle, and I didn't hire it done. I did it myself. And so when you talk about right product, right rate, right time, I'm not going to tell you guys that I got maybe 12 gallon on like I wanted. I probably got closer to 10. Did I get my ounces of product on? Yeah. But did I get the whole farm covered? Nope. Had to go to a meeting that night. So I sprayed 10 acres that went up to this part right here. And then I sprayed another 5 acres. And while I did it, I threw in pasture guard because I had some dog bane down in this draw right here. And I smoked this. It was 95 degrees. Those worms had done some damage on there. I sprayed a plant with a herbicide that should not have responded to that herbicide, but it did because that plant was under duress. That's my fault. And then I didn't spray this up here. And so you can see kind of where the worst of the damage has been in that aerial imagery. Now, I will say this from aerial imagery as well. You have to ground truth this stuff. This just catches green material. But see that strip right there? Entomologist told me, don't you ever spray anything without leaving me a check strip. So I did. That's that check strip. You could tell right to the line where that generic, very inexpensive, $3 an acre product worked very, very effectively. Okay? So I do think that insecticides can work very, very well. Has a lot to do with gallonage, has a lot to do with the time that we get that on. And when he talks about those overlapping generations, that can be a huge challenge for us. We might go out and put an application on, and we go back later and we've got a whole bunch of inch larvae out there, 1.25 inch larvae. And we go and we complain and say, how come it didn't kill them? Well, they might have been 3/4 of an inch to an inch to start. It's going to take some time for that product to either come in contact with them or for them to ingest it. And then all of a sudden we're delayed, right? And if we know that they eat maybe 50 to 75% of what they're going to eat in the last 3 to 4 days of their life cycle, we didn't control them, we maybe just slowed them down a little bit, that's a problem. And so then we get that overlapping deal that occurs, right? And so I do think that I would hope that we wouldn't get numbers like we did this year or overlapping generations like we did this year, but the insecticides do work. Keep in mind though, however, that you have to kind of monitor that a little bit. So the second application, so this is 3 different dates, right? 2 weeks apart. You can see where kind of the second generation kind of started again, mowed off everything again. So this time the whole thing got sprayed with that generic lambda-cy. And again, I'm not throwing this product under the bus. Quite frankly, I like it. I think it worked very well. The entomologist, again, will tell you that we don't see necessarily resistance from those products, at least in Kansas. We do have them in the South. Not, if you're in the retail business, you'll probably hear, well, this didn't work in Texas. You think about the number of acres we're spraying, we've probably introduced some resistance to some of these products. There's no two ways around it. But if we apply that product when that insect is small, and we do a good job of getting gallonage and all those sorts of things, we do a pretty good job. My point is this. I went back in there and I started scouting again. I wasn't sure I really wanted to do anything, but I went out there and I walked around and we talked about those treatment thresholds early. I walked around and I walked up and down through here, and I'd get 5, 7, 9, 1, 0, average in about 4 or 5, and I'm like, man, if it would just rain, I could get by with this. I'd be in good shape. And I got over here, and I got 20, and then 45, and then 30, right? Keep in mind this pest starts in this little area generally, and then just sort of explodes in mass, right? And so again, I went back with that generic lambda-cy, but by the time I caught these huge numbers over here, they were too far gone. And I didn't get them killed soon enough. So my product really was not as effective as I'd like, but that was based upon how the timing that I put that out there and the stage of those larvae how many there were. I mean, if you've got 40 larvae per square foot and you control 65% of them, you still got 3 times what the treatment threshold is. They're still going to eat and they're still going to do something. So I think getting on top of it scouting-wise is important. I do think, though, there are products, as kind of he alluded to. I think you need to talk to your retailers this winter and find out what they saw for their products, because there are products out there that really worked very, very well, gave some longer residuals. There's some products out there that can do that. As a general rule, I would say this, 2 to 3 weeks, give or take, is about what you can expect, understanding that sunlight is going to degrade them, moisture has the potential to degrade them, and they have to get a lethal dose of that. If we're going out and we're spraying on bare ground, nothing's eating that, right? It's going to be a little bit hard to get anything into that insect at that point. We're going to come in contact with some, but we're not going to get them to ingest any at that point. So kind of keep those things in mind. My take home for that is start looking at products and start figuring out what those are going to look like for you.